very much, Craig, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. And thanks to all of you for coming along. I'm going to talk for 40 minutes or so about land. And really, it's... can I have the first slide up?
Yeah.
I've been interested in this topic for a long time. And it's one of these things that's... it's a bit like the kind of archaeology of power. It's the... You know, when you're in a room and you see the kind of wallpaper and the furnishings and the carpet and all the rest of it, you think, oh, I could change that a wee bit, I could maybe have new curtains and the chairs will get a wee bit faded and all the rest of it. But we seldom think about the kind of more fundamental stuff that's going on behind the walls or down in the ground. You know, whose house is this? And who's got rights over my property and all the rest of it. And this stuff seems to have kind of evolved without any great design. And so when I wrote this book called The Poor Had No Lawyers, it was really an attempt to try and get to grips with this topic and understand, you know, how did the way that land is owned in Scotland evolve. And I can't really ad-lib too much because I mean, slides are like prompt. Here.
No, actually. You got the big spanner?
So anyway, the book's called The Poor Had No Lawyers because this is, it's after a 19th century antiquarian and advocate called Cosmo Innes, who was actually brought up in Aberdeenshire. His father was the sheriff of Murrayshire, and as a young boy, his father took over a long lease of Durras Estate on the Dee, and they were eventually evicted from there due to a court case that was brought by the Duke of Gordon. He then became, he trained in the law, he became an advocate, he also became an antiquarian and studied the history of Scotland. And together with a chap called Thomas Thompson, who was the keeper of the records of Scotland, they actually jointly sorted out a lot of the mess that was the registers of Scotland. And also they documented all the laws of the pre-Union Scots Parliament. So that was the first kind of systematic documentation of Scotland's laws prior to 1707. And he also became very critical of the way that law was taught. A lot of law, in his view, was just kind of made up by the so-called institutional writers. And he always appealed to a greater length and depth in Scottish history. And so he wrote a whole series of lectures for students that were called Lectures in Scottish Legal Antiquities. And one of them is about property. And in this lecture, he talks about the land that was divided in the 17th century, which I'll talk about briefly, and how the land came to be divided. The Lord got the whole that was allocated to him, the poor caught none. The poor had no lawyers. And that was his conclusion in this little essay. So I thought, well, that's quite clever, because not only did the poor not have any lawyers, but also they didn't speak Latin or write Latin, or English for that matter, in many parts of Scotland. And they also weren't in the habit of going to Edinburgh and kind of checking the title deeds that were being handed into the Register of Saycedes every day. So the poor always suffered when it came to the distribution and allocation of land, because they were disadvantaged economically, politically, and legally. And of course they were disadvantaged politically for the very obvious reason that until the 19th century, you know, the franchise was held by the aristocracy. Even through the 19th century, the franchise was held by male landowners, property owners. It wasn't until 1920 that women got the vote. And that means essentially that a lot of the laws that govern the way that land's owned in Scotland are not only of some antiquity or rooted in some antiquity, but they also arguably haven't got any democratic basis.
Sorry.
Haven't got any democratic basis at all, because when they were passed, you know, at least half the population didn't even have a franchise. The other interesting thing about when you write a book, the cover is all kind of organised by the publisher, and only about a week before publication do you ever get a sight of it. So when I imagine this photograph without all the words on it, I thought that's a very interesting photograph, and where is it, who took it, and I was told that it was taken by an amateur photographer called James Dias Davidson, who's also the head of history at Huntley Academy. And if you go to his website, you'll see he specialises in taking photographs of kind of lost, abandoned settlements in upland Aberdeenshire and Banffshire. So this particular one is taken at a place called Ardagh, at the head of Glen Gairn. Now Ardagh used to be, in Ardagh there used to be 20 or 30 houses. There was a school, there was a Catholic church, there was a Church of Scotland, there was a shop. These used to be very busy places. Now just one building standing. And the reason why Ardagh is abandoned as a settlement was because in 1886, when they passed the Crofting Acts, which was to give protection, legal protection, security of tenure to peasants, to crofters, they restricted that because there was pressure to extend that over the whole of Scotland, particularly in Aberdeenshire. But they restricted it, the House of Lords moved an amendment to restrict it to the counties of the Napier Commission, which was the commission that had been set up to look at crofting issues at the land struggle, to those counties that they had visited and taken evidence in. And they hadn't visited Aberdeenshire and taken evidence in Aberdeenshire, so it was excluded. So large parts of Highland, Aberdeenshire, Banffshire, Perthshire, etc. were left out. And thus these people had no legal protection beyond a year and could be evicted at any time, and that's why nobody's left here. It's also, funnily enough, my wife's great-great-great-grandfather's brother was the parish priest in Ardagh, and may very well have lived in this house, I'm not very sure. Anyway, so that's just a wee kind of serendipitous tale. Now let's get started. So I grew up, went to school, I left school, didn't like it and all the rest of it, got my higher still, but I went to work in a sporting estate as a gillie. This is me as a young lad. This is my pony called Brandy, who I love dearly. Great working with animals at that age, you know, you build this great bond between you and a pony. And my job was to go out the hill and if it shot anything, put it on the back of the pony and take it, often great distances back. It was quite hard work, but it was also very rewarding. And also brought me into personal contact with a lot of Britain's aristocracy and with kind of global figures like the De Beers family and stuff like that, with whom I used to spend maybe an hour waiting for the wind to change direction or whatever, or the clouds to lift, talking about all sorts of stuff. So it was a very great education into the life of the elites in Britain at a young age. And I went to university to study forestry because I'd also been working in forestry in Aberfeldy as a young boy. And it was whilst I was at the university in Aberdeen studying forestry, some of you may remember there was a big controversy over the planting trees of the flow country in Caithness and Sutherland in the far north of Scotland. The flow country is a great big expanse you can see here of kind of flat, wet, deep peat. It's very, very rare in world terms. And it's also the important habitat for greenshank and various other birds. The RSPB were very a lot of nature conservationists were very concerned about this planting. I was concerned about it because of the birds and stuff, but I was more concerned about it because the chief executive of the company that was responsible for this, who was selling this idea to people like Hurricane Higgins and Shirley Porter and Terry Logan, came to give us a lecture and afterwards asking questions. I said, why is the government, and this was the Thatcher government in 84, 85, why is the government giving millions of pounds in tax breaks to rich people in London to plant trees 500 miles away in the north of Scotland? Why doesn't it just give that same amount of money it's forgoing in tax receipts as grants to the farmers and the landowners and the crofters who own this land, and they can plant the trees? I mean, I just didn't understand why they were doing this. And I didn't get a very satisfactory response, or rather, I don't remember what the response was, but afterwards I do remember my professor coming to me and saying that he thought it might not be such a good idea if I were to continue asking such politically controversial questions. And I didn't know what he meant. I mean, I was just a naive student, you know. I thought the purpose of uni was to ask questions, you know. And I told him that. I mean, he was a soil scientist. I said, well, you know, you haven't got anywhere by not asking questions, you know, so I'm doing the same thing. But it was clear that there were some topics that were out of bounds. So when you started talking about kind of land and power and money, that wasn't deemed a topic for polite conversation. So I thought, oh, right, okay, you don't want to hear these questions, I'll, you know, continue asking them. So that's what kind of got me interested in the land issue. And I went to the Arts Library and picked up a book by Tom Johnson, The History of the Working Classes in Scotland. And he's got a great chapter called The Reaving of the Common Lands in Scotland, where he talks about adding together the common lands of the boroughs, the extensive commons of the villages, the hamlets, the common pasturages, the commons attached to run-rent tenancies. We shall be rather under than overestimating the common acreage in the latter part of the 16th century at fully 1/2 of the entire area of Scotland. So I kind of got to asking, like, well, what's happened to this? You know, this is nobody. You know, this wasn't a topic of conversation. So in a sense, that's what I've been trying to do ever since. And it's also important, I'm going to start the talk by emphasising how important land is. It's not just to do with kind of the flow country or the Highlands or places like that, but it's to do everywhere. You know, everywhere we're all you know, terrestrial creatures. We need somewhere to live and shelter and eat. When Gordon Brown came to power in his first budget in 1997, this was in the back of there'd been a property bubble or boom. he said his first budget in June 1997, "I will not allow house prices to get out of control." By the time he left as Chancellor, they'd trebled. Our current Chancellor, the dear George Osborne, went to Ireland in February 2010 and said, February 2008, and said, "Ireland stands as a shining example of the art of the possible in long-term economic policy making." Now, I just highlight these contributions from two significant figures in British politics, or chancellors who meant to know about money, to illustrate the fact that we could completely ignore a lot of really important things that are going on. The financial crisis started in the United States of America as a Ponzi scheme, where people were lent money they couldn't afford to repay, or houses that they were told would increase in price, and therefore they would be able to repay it because the houses would go up in value. That all crashed, never came about, they defaulted. That in turn led to a crisis in interbank lending. It brought the Irish economy down. At the height of the Irish boom, 478% of the Irish GDP was bound up in property and land. So a failure to properly manage land can actually bring a country to its knees. And this is the Chief Executive of the Anglo-Irish Bank, Sean Fitzpatrick, who's now in court facing about 6 charges of criminal activity, money laundering, not money laundering, yeah, I think there's actually one charge related to money laundering. That's the unfinished headquarters of the Anglo-Irish Bank, or the Banks of the Liffey, a kind of RBS of Ireland. And it was interesting because David Cameron was off in Brussels a couple of years ago, and he was negotiating to try and exempt Britain from any stronger currency controls in the European Union following the euro crisis. And Ian Rankin put out this great wee tweet. He said the United Kingdom consists of 90,060 square miles. David Cameron has fought tooth and nail for one of them, meaning, of course, the City of London, the square mile. And the City of London is the only constituency in Britain that doesn't have a democracy, where businesses have the vote and individuals have the vote as well, but they're way over the businesses have many more votes. They've got a permanent seat in the House of Commons. They see legislation before even MPs do, and a lot of British politics is disproportionately influenced by the interests of the City of London. And other aspects of this that I picked up on when I was kind of younger, being in Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire, and all the rest of it, I went out to the hills and all the rest of it, and I met a man called Adam Watson, who's a scientist, ecologist. Some of you might know, big long beard, and he specialises in ptarmigan and snow patches and the cairngorms and things. But he wasn't just interested in nature, he was also interested in people. He introduced me to this woman on the top right called Jean Bain. Jean Bain's now sadly dead. She died in 1994. But she lived in a farm called Ardick as well, actually, but not the same one, overlooking Balmoral. That's Loch Nagar there in the top left. And who this is? Selina Scott, yes. At that time she was with Grandpa Television, and that's her doing a programme with Jean Bain's son, Rob, who sadly died 4 years ago. Now the significance of Jean was that Jean, when she died, with her died Deeside Gaelic. She was the last surviving native speaker of Deeside Gaelic. And the death of Deeside Gaelic, which was a very distinctive form of the language, was not unconnected with the fact that upland Aberdeenshire and Banffshire didn't get security of tenure in the 19th century, so people just left and were evicted. So with them went the language. And when she died, that was the last of Deeside Gaelic, which is now a dead language. And a couple of years ago, after Rob died, the farm was put up for sale as a residential development opportunity and bought by an architect in London. And this is to emphasise that kind of land relations and culture are intimately connected. Also, this is not just a rural issue, it's also an urban issue. This is the Roots car plant in Linwood in the 1960s, when it came to Linwood. This is the town centre of Linwood as it looked in the late 90s, rundown. And what had happened was the landowner of the town centre, because the whole of the town centre was under a long lease from the council, had jacked up the rents in the shops, and they slowly began moving out in the centre of Linwood. In fact, it got given that award at Pluke and Plinth as a pretty depressing place. And so the folk in Linwood were upset by this. And the lease was taken over by a company called Balmore Limited, and they were doing this rent rises and forcing people out. And Wendy Alexander, who was the MSP of the area, said from 2001 Balmore's stewardship was simply a disgrace following on from years of neglect. They repeatedly refused to meet community or elected representatives. And then along came Tesco and said, well, we'll save the town centre, we'll take it over. And people said, well, aye, okay. But then a number of questions started getting asked about Tesco's role in the whole of this. And again, Wendy Alexander said, in 2005 and 6, when I and many in that community were actively looking for a major retailer to step in, the Tesco representatives gave no indication to the community of any long-standing relationship with Balmore. They should have done so. And the reason they should have done so was that Balmore was a front company for Tesco, and it deploys front companies around the country, basically to evict and clear people so they can come in and get the land cheap and essentially take it over. So the local councillor said Tesco came in like a knight in shining armour, said they were going to fix it. It was all a con. Tesco responded, it's common for Tesco to use an agent and secure land. Balmore Properties was an agent for Tesco at that time. And the thing is, the people in Linwood knew nothing about what was going on here. They were completely out of control. They never knew anything about Balmore. They didn't know anything about Tesco's relationship with, and this was their town centre. And this is why land is important, because it's a kind of archaeology of power. Yeah? It's the way in which, over medium and long term, our environment changes, and we need to be far more in control of that process than we are just now. So Linwood, strictly speaking now, is Tesco Town, literally. The centre of Linwood is wholly owned by Tesco. And so the people are now involved in consultations with Tesco. And so, in a sense, it's far better than it was. But it's certainly not the choice that the folk in Linwood would have made had they been in charge. Now, I started my kind of proper interest in this in the 90s I met a publisher who reminded me that in 1979 a chap called John McEwen had written this book called Who Owns Scotland, and I had read it at the time. And in fact, he was actually a forester. So this is one of the books I brought into uni, and I kind of showed this to my professor on another occasion, which he said, well, we're not going to put that on the reading list. And I said, oh, that's really interesting, But anyway, the question of who owns Scotland is quite important because, kind of unless you have more knowledge, it's very difficult to debate these topics. And it's interesting because in the past, for example, this is 1871, there was a survey done of the whole of the United Kingdom looking at property ownership. And it was all documented in a great big survey in 1872. People like Tom Johnson in 1910 published his book, Our Scots Noble Families, which was a searing philippic against the noble families in Scotland, well worth a read. That's the 1872 return. In 1910, Lloyd George and Churchill were planning the People's Budget in 1910. They included the land tax, and part of that land tax, it would be necessary to find out who owned the land. So the inland revenue from 1910 to 1914 mapped every square inch of the whole of Britain and Ireland, and on 4 pages of a notebook, a field book, they documented the ownership of that land, the occupation of the land, and the value of that land. They did that with paper and ink 100 years ago, and we still haven't managed that today. This is a map taken from Hamilton. So 100 years ago, we knew all this information. It wasn't in the public domain, it was held by the Inland Revenue, but the information was all there. This is a recent exhibit in the National Archives showing this survey, and this is a little glass cabinet showing the house where Keir Hardie bought for £500 in Old Cumnock. I run a website called whoownscotland.org.uk, which you have to pay a subscription for, because it costs me quite a bit of money to do the research, but that's an attempt to try and get all this information out into the public domain. So those are the kind of reasons why land is important. I just want to briefly now move on to kind of the central theme of the book, which is about how did we get to this place. And I recount 5 key, what I call land grabs, and the first one was feudalism. And I have a chapter called Robert the Bruce, a murdering medieval warlord, which my nationalist friends don't like. And in response I say to them, well, what of murdering and medieval and warlord do you disagree with? Because, of course, in those days, that's, in my view, what principally motivated someone like Bruce. I mean, he swore an oath to Edward, he had lands in England, he fought for Edward and all the rest of it. And the nobility at that time were changing their allegiances left, right and centre. Now, of course, the chance to gain the crown of Scotland was a very important prize. And Bruce went for it and won, of course. But securing the crown of Scotland meant he owned the whole of Scotland, because the crown owned all the land, and it gave you huge power to grant in charters territories to the nobility and your friends around the country. So that was the first main land grab. The second one, which has not really been talked about much, was the 16th century, during the Reformation, and the lead up to the Reformation in 1560. Scotland had quite a late Reformation compared to the rest of Europe. But what was happening was that the church in those days was very, very wealthy. It was about 50 times more wealthy than the crown was. And it owned extensive areas of land. This is Trefragle Abbey outside Maple in Ayrshire. And the church owned about 80% of Ayrshire at that time. It was very, very wealthy, extensive lands. And of course the nobility were keen to get their hands on this. And one way they did it was they got their relatives, their sons or nephews, into the church as officers, usually as a commendator. And they were like the chief executive, the financial officer. So they were responsible for money and legal affairs. And so they slowly passed over in life rents, i.e. rent for life, parts of the church lands. That was then converted from life rent to feud, in other words, ownership, and this land then became appropriated by the nobility, such that when John Knox, secured the Reformation in 1560, fully expecting that the wealth of the church could be used to educate the poor, or to educate the whole of the population, a school in every parish. A third would be used to give directly to the government, to the crown, to help run the country, and a third would be retained by the church to run its own affairs. They opened the books and found out there was virtually nothing there. The 17th century also saw the sort of what I call the third land grab, which is when the lawyers got involved, and they really were there to legitimise the appropriation of property that had taken place earlier on. So 1617 we set up the Register of Sessions. So if you recorded a deed in the Register of Sessions and you hung on to it for 40 years, it was beyond challenge. And that basically legitimised a lot of the theft of the church lands. And throughout the 17th century, the Scottish Parliament spent most of its time legislating on property matters and securing rights of landowners, as well as devising new ways of killing Highlanders as well. Issues that looked upon were things like the law of succession. I mean, today it's remarkable that children, for example, still don't have the legal right to inherit property. So if you own a house or a farm or any land at all, of course, you're perfectly free to leave it to your children if you wish, but you're also perfectly free to leave it to the Edinburgh Cat Dog Home. And if you do so, your children have got no claim against that property whatsoever. This is the Earl or Duke of somebody, I can't remember, Hopetoun, that's right, because I had a wee gig, you mentioned Leslie Riddick, who did a wee show in the festival a few years ago, and I had a wee thing about the Earl of Hopetoun had done this interview in which he said that his eldest son would inherit the estate, you see, and the interviewer was saying, well, you've got two older daughters, and well, you know, they won't get it, it'll be the elder son. He said, well, you've got two sons and they're twins. I said, yes, but one is 6 minutes older than the other. So I'm just using this wee tale as a kind of just a wee thing, and someone in the audience picked up on it and told the Earl of Hopetoun. So I got a phone call on Saturday night from the Earl of Hopetoun asking me if I would desist from talking about his children's private affairs in a public show. And I said, well, it wasn't me that gave an interview and all these facts to the Scotsman newspaper, and 32,000 people reading it at the time, you know. So anyway, so succession and primogeniture, which was only abolished in '64, have played a really important part in cementing elite ownership of property. The fourth land grab was in the 17th and 18th century, when the vast common lands of the parishes were divided, mainly under an Act of 1695, which allowed them to be divided from a petition of one landowner. So I've been working quite a bit around the country visiting common land. This is a place called the Hill of Ailith, above Ailith in eastern Perthshire. 1920s, this was still a piece of common land. And the Earl of Airlie decided he was going to sell the farms, the tenant farms around the hill. But not only did he sell the farm of Blindwell Eyes and Whiteside to the tenant farmers, he also gave them a share of the common. Now he didn't own this common, right? The farmers were quite happy to go along with this. The folk in Ailith didn't know anything about this, because just like the poor who had no lawyers, they weren't standing at the doors of the Register of Sessions in Edinburgh, checking what the Earl of Airlie was up to. And it wasn't until after the war, when we began giving grants to farmers to grow food, that the farmers began putting fences to demarcate these new boundaries of land that had been appropriated 20 years earlier. And at that point, the folk in Ailith got very agitated. One Sunday, they all decided to march up on the hill. This is them marching up in 1947 in their Sunday best with spades. And the idea was that they were going to exercise their ancient right to feel and divot, so the ancient rights to cut, fuel and divot on the hill. And instead of cutting them in kind of patches, square, neat patches, they decided to cut it in long, long lines, which would follow the lines of the fence. So they used their legal rights to cut the ground from underneath the fence, and the fences collapsed. And there's nothing anyone could do about that. The following Friday, of course, a smaller number of them took matters more into their own hands. This is one of the town councillors, Matt Crichton. They decided to actually destroy the fences by cutting them. Now that was a criminal offence, and so he was arrested. He was later released without charge. And the town council then struggled for 20 years to try and rectify the situation because it was very, very difficult. Because by this time, the prescriptive period, in other words, you had a title, plus you had to wait for a certain amount of time, was then 20 years. So after 20 years, this title was beyond challenge. This is one small example of what's been happening right across Scotland. In my investigations, I continually find bits of common land. This is a piece of land in North Lanarkshire, in fact in the parish of Carluke, in yellow in the middle there, which is a surviving common. I was particularly interested in this because it's in the middle of what was then Britain's largest, Europe's largest onshore wind farm, the Black Law wind farm run by Scottish Power. And so I phoned up a guy I knew in Scottish Power and said, see, you've got a piece of common land in the middle and you don't have any turbines. He said, no turbines on it, or pipe, or cabling, or ducts, or anything there. And he says, no, we know about that. He said, we didn't know who would sign the lease with. And it was quite clear he'd signed a lease up in the Green with the Forestry Commission and over here with the Earl of Hamilton and all the rest of it. But he didn't know who would sign a lease on a piece of common land. And I said, well, that actually is an interesting legal question. But as a consequence, they left it alone and didn't do anything on it. Now, at the same time, the people in Carluke were not even aware that this common land belonged to the parish. So they weren't in a position to negotiate with Scottish Power. Hey, why don't you stick a turbine on there and we could earn 150 or 200,000 pounds a year. So we proceeded, and that's the wee piece of land there, you see. And you can see it wouldn't have been any bother at all to shift one of these wee turbines over there. Anyway, so we spent 4 years trying to register a title to this. We eventually succeeded last year. And it's the first time, to my knowledge, that a community's managed to reclaim some common land legally. Now, the fifth land grab was the borough commons, the common good land, the land in the towns, the royal boroughs of Scotland. And this was exempted from the Commons Division legislation because it was important land for the people in the towns. And even up until 1820, this is a map of Irvine in Ayrshire. You can see in yellow there, that's all the common lands of Irvine. Quite extensive areas of land. And today, in places like the Borders, of course, they celebrate the common ridings festivals. And these are ancient ceremonies where the horsemen would ride around the boundaries of the town's lands to make sure that the aristocracy didn't encroach on the town's land. Of course, the town land in a royal borough, like Glasgow, was very important because if you owned land in a royal borough, you were a vassal of the crown. You could stand for Parliament before the Reform Acts, and you had a vote. So this was very valuable land. Places like Aberdeen were actually given large areas of land by Robert Bruce, in fact, after Bannockburn, the so-called Freedom Lands. 14 miles in circumference around Aberdeen was granted to the people of Aberdeen. But Scotland wasn't governed very well. In the 15th century, we passed an act that the Officers of Boroughs Act, because there were meant to be regular annual elections in boroughs, and they stopped having regular elections, and there were many riots in many towns in Scotland. So Parliament passed an act, and instead of insisting that you have these annual elections, they actually said that the new town council shall be selected every year by the old town council, and that the officers shall be selected and appointed by the two councils meeting together. So in other words, they abolished early primitive democracy, which was restricted to the burgesses, of course, but they limited it in 1469, I think was the year. And that meant that up until 1833 Borough Reform Act, Scotland's royal boroughs were the scene of rampant municipal corruption and nepotism, as people just appointed their pals to run the council, and as a consequence alienated a lot of the common land. Now this led to bankruptcy in many cases. This is St Andrews went bankrupt in 1797, and in order to recover some money, it leased out the valuable common lands of St Andrews, which of course is where people play golf, probably the most famous common lands in Scotland, to a rabbit farmer called Mr Dempster. Mr Dempster bred rabbits here, and there were rabbit wardens. And of course people continued to play golf, but as the rabbits multiplied, the 9-hole courses turned into 50-hole courses, and bunkers appeared where bunkers weren't before. And there was the start of the community wars, or the rabbit wars. And there was violence, and blood was drawn on the golf course as the rabbit wardens were attacked by people, and people killed the rabbits. And eventually it all went to court, and a local landowner gave a sum of money to the council to buy out the lease, and peace was restored. So this was important stuff in the development of Scotland's towns and boroughs. Even in Edinburgh, where I live at the moment, the whole of the new town was bought using the Common Good Fund. So in those days, towns were in Glasgow here, you built your tram system. You don't have one anymore, we have a brand new tram system in Edinburgh. But the tram system was built by the proceeds of the Common Good Fund. Edinburgh's towns and cities were wealthy places, but a lot of it's disappeared. And of course the sixth land grab was when sort of land ran out here and we went overseas and stole other people's land in the British Empire. And in fact the last act of British colonial possession Took place in 1955, in fact, off the west coast of Scotland, on the small islet of Rockall. In the Cold War, Britain was concerned that the Soviets might put some equipment on Rockall to track the missile testing range from the USs. And so they decided to take possession of Rockall. And so the Admiralty asked the Colonial Office, which at this time was separate from the Foreign Office, asked the Colonial Office, which at that time also was beginning the process of decolonisation and working out how to extricate Britain from its colonies, asked the Colonial Office, how do you colonise? And they said, well, it's very simple. And they actually took out the charter that had been given to Captain Cook, who seized Australia, and they basically just get a royal warrant from the Queen, and he gives an order to a member of the armed forces to go sail, seize the land, raise a flag, claim it in the name of Her Majesty, and Bob's your uncle. That's it. So that's what they did on Rockall. They landed there on the 18th September 1955. This was the plaque that was put there by authority of our Queen, blah blah blah, head of the Commonwealth. A landing was effected. Union flag was hoisted in possession of the island, was taken in the name of Her Majesty. So that's how you do it. And of course, this whole process of colonisation is still ongoing around the world, but also in space now. I don't own any land on planet Earth, but I do own some land on the moon. And this is a deed. I bought it for £12.95 in Safeways. And I own lot number 32 in the area F4, Quadrant Charlie in the Oceanus Procellarum. And I do this with students that we've been teaching now and again, and ask them, do I really own up to the moon? I've got a piece of paper that proves I do, and we can talk about that afterwards if you like. But one of the reasons, arguably, why I don't own a piece of the moon is in 1967, when the space race was getting going, and the West was very concerned that the Soviets were ahead and might militarise space, we signed a treaty, the UN Treaty on Outer Space, that basically said that space was a commons for all of humanity, and there's a prohibition on the militarisation of space. You can't do weapons in space. You can go and do peaceful exploration, and astronauts, I think Article 30 says that astronauts are the envoys of mankind, and if you meet alien life, you're to be polite to them, and all this kind of stuff. And there's actually an office in Vienna called UNUSA, United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs. They've always fancied working, and they kind of make sure this treaty is being implemented and all the rest of it. But things are hotting up in outer space because there's now asteroids, and this is an asteroid called Eros, which have got more precious metals like platinum and titanium on them than exist on the whole of planet Earth. And there's now the technology potentially available to go out to space, grab these asteroids and bring them back to Earth. So these places are valuable. And in fact, Eros was where the Schumacher satellite landed a number of years ago. But there was a property developer in California who had taken out in the Californian registry filed a claim for ownership of Eros. And so when this Schumacher satellite kind of probe, it was landed on Eros. Of course, that was it, sent all its data back, and then it kind of ran out of battery and it was just abandoned. And so he sent an invoice to NASA for $20 for parking charges, saying this is my asteroid. And of course, it got thrown out. But there are American corporations now want to rip up this 1967 treaty. They want to appropriate areas of outer space. NASA has leased one of its launch pads in Cape Canaveral to the private sector. So this is the next frontier, if you like, in the race for grabbing and appropriating the global commons. Now I just want to finish off with some kind of lessons, starting off with some lessons from Europe, because the thing I learned looking at kind of land is countries in Europe do things very differently, often much, much better. Principally because, unlike France and places, we didn't have a revolution, so they kind of managed to sort out a lot of these issues much earlier on. And when the EU had a crisis in recent years over the euro currency in Greece and all the rest of it, there was a kind of panic, and it's worth remembering that our politicians are not as much in control of events as they like us to think they are. And during the euro crisis, so I'll just skip that, the Spanish finance minister said Spain is not Greece, Greece has gone down, and there was contagion in Spain. Greece is not Ireland, the Greek finance minister insisted nothing could be as bad as Ireland. Ireland's not in Greek territory, said Brian Lenihan. Neither Spain nor Portugal is Ireland. Ireland wasn't getting a very good press in these days. Portugal's not Greece. Spain is neither Ireland nor Portugal. So this was kind of lessons in basic geography. Italy's not Spain. Spain was starting to get into trouble. And then I like this one, Spain's not Uganda. I don't know what's going on there. And then the Ugandan foreign minister said, Spain. Our economy's on an even keel. But Europe does things quite sensibly. I mean, for example, in governance terms, it has very, very local governance. So it has municipalities, communes, and things where small numbers of people, 10,000 people, run their own commune, collect their own taxes, and do things at a local level. Banking, for example, one of the reasons Germany's still cruising along is that 70% of its banks are either owned by local government, at the Sparkassen, or they're owned by cooperatives. So 70% of German banking is in the hands of the people. And this means that the savings of German citizens don't, like they do in this country, go in mainly to property, inflated property values, which is completely unproductive in the economy. It's not generating any wealth. The savings of Germans are saved in these banks and they're invested in German industry. And that's why Germany has a quite thriving manufacturing sector. And you can see that in terms of municipal government, this is the number of the lowest tier of local government across Europe. And Scotland, with its 32 local authorities, has got the most concentrated local governance anywhere in Europe. France is a bit mad with 36,000. But if we had, and we had parish government, the equivalent of municipalities from 1897 till 1930, so these are Scotland's parishes, which used to have their own parish councils, which we could have strengthened, but instead we abolished them in 1930. But that's kind of how the map of Scottish local government, if we'd kept it in 1930, would look, and it would put us kind of equal between Belgium and Germany. And if you look at kind of Fife as an illustration, you see that the number of councils is reduced to just like one. So you can see what this trend is. So the thing is that local municipalities have quite significant powers. In Norway, for example, half your taxes are paid directly to the local municipality, your income tax. So the people you meet in the playground, in the shops, in the pub, are the people who are making decisions about how to spend your money. So this builds quite a bit of trust and accountability. But here we're on the opposite trajectory, and we're basically eliminating local government, which I think is a very bad idea. That's where Scotland would be, halfway between Italy and Belgium, if we still had parish councils and town councils. And it's something I think we need to redress. But also in countries like Finland, a lot of the land is owned by small-scale owners. So Metsä is a large forest products company. It's the second largest one in the world. And it's a cooperative. It's owned by 125,000 people who, between them, own half the private forests in Finland, an average of 40 hectares. So these people, with their small land holdings, have got a stake in the third largest forest products company in the world, and sell the products all around the world. I'll just skip that. In recent years, of course, in Scotland, there's been growing interest in the land question, mainly in the kind of rural north and west. The Arson Crofters here in '92 gained control of their land. This was the Chair Alan McCrae celebrating on the day the news came in. And the story of this particular episode is well told by Jim Hunter in his book, Community Ownership in the Highlands and Islands. And it tells a great success story of people like, this is Willie McSporran or Gia, who've taken control over their own lives, and for whom, who owns the land has been very important. I mean, Gia was owned by a convicted criminal called Malcolm Poitier, who had been convicted in the Australian courts of hiring a hitman to kill his first wife. And these are the kind of people we were entrusting with the ownership of important places like Gia, on which 16 people lived. Or the island of Egg, which was owned by a German fire-eating artist called Maruma. And I remember speaking to someone at Egg at the time, and they'd just taken a hire purchase agreement out to buy a fridge, I think, the days of hire purchase in the 90s. And he said, I had to fill in 2 pages of forms to buy a £100 freezer, whatever. And yet this chap, and we don't even know if he does own the island, can breeze in here, nobody asked any questions, and he gets to own the whole island. There's something a bit off there. So we've seen a big growth in community asset acquisitions, a bit of decline in recent years, but an important phenomenon. But still, large chunks of Scotland are being sold on the international property market for increasingly inflated prices. And in the cities and towns, we need more accountability as well, because one of the issues is to do with kind of money and value. You may remember the big fire in Glasgow a few years ago, the Co-op building over the Kingston Bridge. When these kind of things happen, I'm a kind of sad character, and my first instinct is who owns this? So I found out this building was owned by a company called Strabane Properties Limited in Belfast. I bought it in 2003. But because it was an empty industrial building, it was exempt from non-domestic rates, from business rates. You don't pay any rates on that. But the rateable value is £400,000 a year. So had they been paying a tax on their property and their land, they'd have been paying about £160,000 a year. I calculated that, you know, up to now, we're talking about over £1 million that's been foregone because they're not paying non-domestic rates. And yet, they expect sort of Clyde Fire and Rescue to come and put out the fire. It was a big fire, 20 fire engines and all the rest of it. They expect the police to maintain public order and secure the property. And it was a long time before that road was opened. They expect the courts, which are financed by the taxpayer, to be there to resolve any disputes they have with insurers or liability for neighbouring occupants. In other words, their enjoyment of that property and its rise in value is wholly dependent on the society and the services that society provides to protect their interest in that property. And therefore, all owners of property should pay something to society in tax. And yet, places like this don't. And that's one of the issues with land, is building a more equitable framework of property taxation. And it was highlighted for me a number of years ago in the 90s when the Jubilee line was completed in London. This was out to Canary Wharf. Now, this cost us £3.5 billion. And there was a property developer called Don Riley who owned quite a bit of land out there. And he was very happy with this because, of course, he saw his land in the East End of London rise in value considerably, because now it was within commuting distance of large numbers of people who could get there on an underground paid for by the taxpayer. And so he went around and he calculated within 500 metres of every new tube station by how much the land had increased in value. And he calculated that it increased by 13.5 billion. That was his calculation. London School of Economics then did a study and found it 9.75 billion. So we're talking about 10 or 11 billion pounds by which the land increased in value in very near vicinity to these new tube stations. And yet we paid for the railway. Now we could have paid for the railway by a tax on just a third of that land value rise. And we'd have got the railway, the public would have got the railway at no cost. And they'd still have made £7 or £8 billion. So this is why land matters, because we're living in a time of austerity, we're living in a time where growing inequality, but if you have property, if you have land, particularly if you have valuable land, particularly in towns and cities, you can sit on it, you can speculate, you can wait for the council and government to make improvements and build trams and borders railways and general do regeneration and reap the rewards. Now, this all came to a head a couple of years ago with a report by Professor James Mirrlees, the Mirrlees report looking at the British tax system. And he argued for a land value tax, which is a tax on the value of the land, excluding the property. And he said the economic case was almost deniable. Why then do we not have one? Why indeed is the possibility barely part of mainstream political debate that proponents consider it marginal and unconventional? And the reason is, of course, because significant vested interests oppose it. The banks, for example, the vast majority of the £1.5 trillion that private people own in private debt in Britain is tied up in mortgages. We have bound ourselves to extensive levels of private debt, which the banks now hold on the balance books. The last thing they want to see is land values dropping. And yet that would be the thing that would boost the British economy if we didn't have all these billions of pounds tied up in dead assets. I'll just skip that. And this was also brought home to me recently as well when I was doing some work on this topic and I was looking at Denmark. Denmark has a land tax. And not only do people in Denmark, Danish citizens, pay tax on the land they own in Denmark, but they also pay tax on land they own outside Denmark. So when I discovered this, I contacted SCAT, who are the Danish tax authorities, and said, do you know that 400,000 acres of land in Scotland are owned by Danish citizens? And they didn't know that. And I said, how much tax is paid by Danish citizens, how much land tax is paid by Danish citizens on property they own in Great Britain? And they said there's 502 properties in Britain. And I said, no, there's not. There's far, far more than that. And it raises a minuscule amount of money, 5 million or something. I said, no, you should be raking in hundreds of millions. And I said, do you want to, come to some arrangement? Which, by the way, I'm kind of suspicious about where it was. But anyway, this chap here, Mr. Paulson, Anders Paulson, he's now the second largest landowner in Scotland. He owns 175,000 acres of land. He's got another £2 billion at his disposal. He wants to buy more land. And yet he's not paying a penny of tax. Well, sorry, I'll correct that. He may well be paying the land tax in Denmark. I don't know. But he's certainly not paying a penny of tax to the local authorities in Scotland where he owns his land. So his taxes, if he's paid them, and I'm sure he is, are being used to pay for nice kindergartens in his home municipality of Esbjerg. And in Denmark, they're very sensible. You should go and see the James plays at the Edinburgh Festival if you have the opportunity. The third play is James III. His wife, of course, was Queen Margaret of Denmark. And she makes this stirring speech at the end of the speech where the king has now been sort of kicked out. She's claiming to run Parliament and appealing to these nobles who are just squabbling and aren't giving her any respect. And has a great speech which starts out with a line along the lines of, I'm a Dane, I come from a rational country. Denmark's a rational country, and so they value all their land, they know what the values of the land are, they know what the property values are, they've got an information system, it's all in the public domain, and they can properly manage property and deal with property bubbles and all the rest of it. And just to conclude, I grew up in Kinross, a wee town, the capital of Kinrossshire, and it was a county town, although we ran it together with Perth and Kinross. But this was the town hall where I used to go for various meetings. My mum was prominent in the local Liberals and various meetings in here. We also had the Kinross Folk Festival. Ali Bain used to come down when he was about 17 years old in a sort of stiff Harris tweed jacket and plays fiddle. Used to dance out in the street here. Next door is the Carnegie Library on the left with the Crowstep Gables. I used to spend a lot of time reading and things. Now if you go through Kinross now, this building, the town hall, which was built by public subscription, we didn't raise the money, it was raised in the 1920s, but it was raised by the people of Kinross, and that's the plaque up there that says as much, and it was dedicated to the memory of those who died in the war, in the First War. So this was built by public subscription, it forms part of the common good of the people of Kinross, and yet it's been left to decay and ruin. It's now empty, it's riddled with dry rot, and Perth and Kinross Council wants to put it in the market for £250,000. And it was in the books as worth something like 250 because it's a liability. And it was denied that it belonged to the people of Kinross, and they had to fight a legal battle to prove it was theirs. But the more significant point is that in places like Kinross, not only did we run the county of Kinross, but we also ran our own town. We were substantially autonomous. And the town hall was an important focus of a lot of civic events. And now in many towns across Scotland, the kind of political and civic heart has been destroyed. People don't have any political power, they're relying on land, on politicians in distant towns. And it's led, in my view, to quite a degree of apathy and decline in people's expectations. It's almost like you've got a referendum coming up. And so for 30 years we've told people that you don't have any say in running your local affairs because you don't need to. And maybe once every 4 years you get a chance to vote for somebody. And your vote may or may not count, and then suddenly you come along and say, would you like to be independent? It's like, hold on. You've never asked us anything terribly important before. So there's a whole issue about kind of local democracy here I think we need to start talking about. Now land reform in as many guises, fiscal reform and all the rest of it, is back on the agenda. The House of Commons Scottish Affairs Committee is looking at it. This is a recent report that came out in May from the Land Reform Review Group, which is 270 pages long. I haven't even read it yet, but there's a lot of good stuff in here. So this topic is back on the political agenda, but it depends on politicians with a spine actually to do something about it. And on that note, I will leave it. Thank you very much.